Early 1944, above central Germany. 8th Air Force formations of B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator heavy bombers cross the Rhine at 25,000 feet under continuous escort by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters on missions whose round-trip distance from East Anglia bases runs to roughly 1,000 miles. German, Freya, and Würzburg radar sets form the first link in the air defense chain as large concentrations of aircraft appear on their scopes and ground controllers work to assign interceptors before the bomber streams pass beyond. Reach. Barely 2 years earlier, in the summer of 1942, only a small number of American heavy bomber groups have reached the United Kingdom, and raids deep into the Reich remain coloured lines drawn across planning maps at high Vicombe. This is the story of one American Air Force, soon nicknamed the Mighty Eighth, operating inside the Anglo-American Combined Bomber Offensive and engaged in a campaign that will seriously weaken the Luftwaffe day fighter arm establish Allied air supremacy over Western Europe and precede the invasion and subsequent liberation of France and Germany by the spring of 1945. The campaign begins as a hazardous experiment in daylight precision bombing that comes close to breaking under the losses of 1943 and continues until the German day fighter force in the West has been worn down. The decisive episodes include the twin Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission Black Thursday over the same ball-bearing city, the point-blank directive that sets the intermediate objective against the fighter arm and its industry, the arrival of Merlin-powered Mustangs with drop tanks Big Week in February 1944, and Lieutenant General James Harold Doolittle's order that authorizes escort fighters to hunt as well as to guard. American air doctrine forged between the wars places great faith in fleets of self-defending heavy bombers, flying in daylight to place bombs inside selected factories, power stations, and transportation nodes, with sufficient accuracy to damage an enemy war economy. In contrast to the Royal Air Force's shift toward night area attacks after its own daylight losses become unacceptable in 1939 and 1940. When the United States enters the war in December 1941, Germany is designated the primary enemy, and strategic bombardment from British bases becomes the principal method available for carrying the fight to German soil, until armies and landing craft are ready for a direct return to the continent. 8th Air Force is activated at Savannah, Georgia on 28 January 1942 under Major General Carl Spaatz, while the 8th Bomber Command is established separately on 1 February 1942 at Langley Field, Virginia, together with 8 Fighter Command and 8 Ground Air Service Command. These form the 3 core components. An advance party crosses the Atlantic that same February and sets up temporary headquarters alongside RAF Bomber Command at High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire, so the Americans can study European weather navigation and enemy defences, while building their own parallel organisation. The first B-17 groups begin arriving during the summer of 1942 and fly their initial combat missions against rail yards, airfields and submarine pens in occupied France and the Low Countries, while crews discover that cloud layers often reach 10,000 feet. Winds at altitude can vary by 50 knots in a single mission, and German 88mm flak is directed with deadly precision. Brigadier General Ira Clarence Eaker assumes command of 8th Air Force in England during December 1942 and spends the following year defending continued daylight operations against calls from both Washington and London to abandon the doctrine or merge completely with RAF night bombing. Facing them across the Channel stands the integrated German air defense system built around chains of early warning radar, dense belts of searchlight, and predictor-controlled heavy flak and dedicated day fighter wings such as Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 11, whose task is to mass Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters against each penetrating bomber stream. For the Allies, strategic bombing represents the primary sustained offensive instrument against targets on German territory, before large-scale invasion forces can be assembled. For Germany, preservation of industrial capacity and continued control of the air over the Reich determine how long the war can still be fought. The distance from English bases to key targets in central Germany remains beyond the practical escort range of available fighters throughout 1942 and most of 1943, and shapes early operations. Summer 1942. Grass airfields of East Anglia. The first American heavy bomber groups begin to fill dispersal points, while concrete runways replace mud and Nissen huts multiply across Suffolk and Norfolk. Through the rest of the year and into 1943, more groups arrive until whole clusters of fields in eastern England belong to 8th Air Force. January 1943 brings the Casablanca Directive that formally joins American daylight precision attacks to British night area bombing under the title Combined Bomber Offensive. Together, the two air forces are to maintain continuous pressure on German industry and war potential until the continent can be invaded. June 1943 sharpens the aim when the point-blank directive orders 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command to dismantle the German fighter force and its supporting factories as a necessary step before any cross-channel landing can be attempted. Missions lengthen week by week, from coastal U-boat yards to the smoky factories of the Ruhr. By midsummer, bomber streams exceed 300 aircraft and press eastward beyond the practical escort radius of P-47 Thunderbolt formations operating from English bases. 17 August 1943 marks the deepest penetration yet attempted. 376 B-17 flying fortresses set course for the Messerschmitt assembly plants at Regensburg and the ball-bearing complex at Schweinfurt. 60 bombers never returned to England, scores more limp home with engines feathered and crews dead or wounded at their posts. German day fighter units mass hundreds of Bf-109 and Fev-190 interceptors in layered attacks that continue long after the last escort fighter turns back near the German border. The lesson for planners and crews is immediate. Unescorted heavy bombers cannot survive concentrated defense over central Germany. 14 October 1943 becomes Black Thursday. 291 B-17 seconds again strike Schweinfurt. 77 are shot down and over 120 are damaged, many so badly that they will not fly another combat mission. Losses amount to more than 1/4 of the entire force dispatched that morning. In Washington and London, senior officers question whether daylight strategic bombing can continue in its existing form. Deep penetrations without escort are suspended. Missions shift back to targets within the radius of P-47 groups flying with newly fitted drop tanks. German fighter commanders watch the bomber streams shrink and draw the conclusion that the Reich air defense system has forced the American offensive to pause. Ball-bearing factories begin moving into underground sites. Airframe plants disperse into forests and tunnels to reduce vulnerability to follow-up attacks. On paper, 8th Air Force controls a heavy bomber inventory that passes 1,000 aircraft by late autumn 1943, yet serviceable strength on any given day remains far lower, and replacement crews arrive in units that have already absorbed severe casualties. Some bomb groups finish 1943 with a large share of their original airmen killed, captured, or transferred off operations. The distance from English bases to key targets in central Germany still lies beyond the reliable escort range of available fighters, and deep missions exact a cost in aircraft and men that strains replacement resources. 8th Air Force enters the winter of 1943-1944 under intense pressure, while Lieutenant General Ira Eaker continues to argue for daylight precision bombing and presses Washington for long-range escorts. The year closes with the doctrine still in place, but its survival dependent on the arrival in quantity of new long-range fighter types, including the P-51 Mustang, then being shipped across the Atlantic. 10 October 1943. Skies above Munster. Lieutenant Robert Rosenthal pilots Royal Flush, the only B-17 from the 13, dispatched by the 100th Bomb Group that returns to Thorpe Abbotts that evening. 12 fortresses are missing. Their absence leaves empty hard stands and silent crew huts. Dawn briefings have become grim ritual. Sleepy men crowd into cold Nissen huts, faces lit by a single bulb, while an intelligence officer pulls the curtain from the wall map and reveals red yarn stretching far across Germany. Few speak when the target is named. Crews count the missions remaining on their 25 tour cards and try not to dwell on the odds. Engines cough into life at 4 o'clock in darkness. Ground crews stand in freezing fog and watch the bombers taxi out one by one. Climb through 10,000 feet of cloud is slow and dangerous. Aircraft circle the buncher beacons for long minutes until the stream assembles. At altitude, the sky is brilliant and mercilessly cold. Contrails weave together until the formation appears as a single white river visible for miles. German coastal radars pass the plot inland, and controllers scramble fighters from Reich defense units such as Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 11. Large formations of W-190 and Bf-109 fighters rise to meet the bombers as they cross the Dutch coast. Attacks begin over the North Sea approaches and continue all the way to the target. German pilots bore in head-on at closing speeds above 600 miles per hour. 20mm cannon shells spark across cockpit glass. Gunners fire until 50 caliber barrels glow. Wounded bombers fall away, trailing smoke and flame. Some crews ride their aircraft down, others step into the slipstream at 25,000 feet. Flak over Münster rises in black-patterned boxes at bombing altitude. Robert Rosenthal watches a neighboring fortress disintegrate under direct hits, counts parachutes in the sky, then feels his own aircraft shudder as 2 engines fail. Royal Flush limps home alone on 2 engines, landing with wounded aboard and the ball turret gunner already dead. For the German fighter pilots, the view is different but no less severe. Aircrew in units assigned to Reich defense note that the American formations hold together under repeated attacks, and that even after heavy losses, the boxes close ranks and continue toward the aiming point. Crews on both sides recognize that the bomber streams are larger, the defensive fire heavier, and the rhythm of missions more relentless than earlier in the campaign. Through the autumn of 1943, 8th Air Force heavy bomber losses average several percentage points of dispatched aircraft on each operation, with some individual missions taking far higher casualties. A 25-mission tour feels less like a simple arithmetic problem and more like a test of endurance against statistics that many crews believe are not in their favor. The 100th Bomb Group acquires the nickname Bloody 100th after a series of missions, including Münster, in which it loses a large share of its aircraft and crews in a single day. Replacement crews arrive straight from training fields in the United States, step off the train, and are told they are occupying the hard stands of men whose fate is still unknown. Nose art and squadron rituals become acts of defiance. Men paint girls and cartoon characters on fuselages that may not return by evening. Lieutenant General Ira Eker walks the flight lines, speaks quietly with exhausted crews, and continues to argue that with adequate long-range escort daylight precision bombing can still succeed. Winter 1943-1944. Fighter airfields across East Anglia. Crates open on frozen grass, and new North American P-51 Mustangs emerge into English rain. The type has been designed originally for the Royal Air Force, but now reaches 8th Air Force in quantity with the Packard-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and on later blocks an additional fuselage fuel tank behind the cockpit. With internal fuel and 2 external drop tanks, the Mustang can escort bombers far deeper into Germany than the P-47 and P-38 it begins to replace. Targets such as Berlin move within continuous escort range for the first time in the campaign. January 1944. Headquarters, 8th Air Force. Lieutenant General James Harold Doolittle arrives from the Mediterranean and assumes command on 6 January. He studies the loss reports from Schweinfurt, listens to outgoing Commander Ira Eker, and changes the way the force uses its fighters. Escort units are no longer required to sit close to the bomber boxes at all times. P-51 and P-47 groups receive authority to sweep ahead of the stream, climb above it, and engage the Luftwaffe wherever it forms up. Once the bombers have turned for home, fighters are permitted to descend and strafe airfields, locomotives, and parked aircraft when fuel permits. The bomber formations remain the main weight of the offensive, but long-range fighters now strike as an aggressive screen rather than a passive guard. Through the first months of 1944, more 8th Air Force fighter groups convert to the Mustang. Relay escort tactics are refined so that one group hands the stream to the next at pre-arranged points, allowing the bombers to fly inside a moving shell of fighters from the English coast to deep targets and back. Drop tank installations are modified in the field to ensure reliable release at the moment combat begins. By February, P-51 groups such as the 357th at Leiston are flying their first missions and learning to use the new range and performance in practice. From 20 to 25 February 1944, the American Strategic Air Forces in Britain and Italy carry out Operation Argument, later known to crews as Big Week. Over 6 days, they fly nearly 4,000 heavy bomber sorties and drop more than 20 million pounds of bombs on aircraft plants at Leipzig, Brunswick, Gotha Regensburg, and other targets linked to the German fighter force. 8th Air Force alone loses more than 200 heavy bombers, yet assembly halls and engine works burn and production is disrupted for weeks. Luftwaffe day fighters rise to defend their own factories and suffer heavy losses in aircraft and experienced pilots that cannot be replaced at the same rate. For the first time, long-range escort fighters are present over most of the route to and from the targets, meeting German formations before they can organize attacks on the bomber stream. At the same time, structural weaknesses in the German training and fuel systems become clear. By early 1944, Luftwaffe fighter pilot training programs have been shortened so that new pilots reach the front with roughly 100 to just over 150 flying hours, instead of the much higher totals of the pre-war years, and further reductions follow as fuel shortages deepen. Operational units receive replacements with limited experience on the Bf-100W9 and FW-100W90, while training flights at home fields are curtailed to conserve aviation gasoline. Experienced leaders killed or captured during Big Week and subsequent battles cannot be replaced quickly. The Merlin-powered Mustang, with additional internal fuel and drop tanks, offers a range on the order of 1,800 miles and high-altitude speeds above 430 miles per hour, giving it both the endurance to accompany bombers to the heart of Germany and the performance to fight on favorable terms against the main Luftwaffe day fighters. In the space of one winter, the technical and tactical balance shifts. 8th Air Force now possesses a fighter force that can reach the same factories as its bombers, contest the air over them, and pursue the German fighter arm back to its own airfields. March 1944. Above Leipzig and central Germany, German fighters rise in smaller formations where earlier in the war entire Geschwader had climbed together. Many of the new pilots have far less flying time than their predecessors, and often break away quickly when confronted by converging Mustang and Thunderbolt squadrons. Losses on the German side mount faster than they can be replaced. On some missions, 8th Air Force now dispatches more than 1,000 heavy bombers, covered by several hundred long-range escort fighters, and the bomber stream stretches for scores of miles from lead to tail. In April, the focus of the Strategic Air Campaign shifts toward the rail network in France and Belgium under the Transportation Plan. Major marshalling yards and junctions, such as those at Lille, Brussels, and Rouen, are attacked repeatedly by American and British bombers. By early June, Allied aircraft have flown tens of thousands of sorties and dropped tens of thousands of tons of bombs on rail centres in the invasion approaches, cutting lines, overturning rolling stock, and forcing German troop movements to slow or divert. German divisions ordered toward the Channel coast are increasingly obliged to detrain well short of their intended destinations and complete their moves by road or on foot, while columns are exposed to fighter-bomber attack. 6 June 1944. Normandy. 8th Air Force heavy bombers fly more than 2,300 sorties against coastal batteries, strongpoints, and inland targets behind the assault beaches. Allied air forces as a whole put nearly 11,000 aircraft into the air over southern England and the invasion area that day. The Luftwaffe launches only a few hundred sorties over the same front, and only a small number of German aircraft reach the vicinity of the beaches before being engaged by Allied fighters. From the perspective of the troops landing below the sky, appears almost entirely under Allied control. By midsummer, German day fighter units in the west operate with sharply reduced numbers of serviceable aircraft. Repeated attacks on airfields and rail links combine with the oil campaign to limit flying hours. Refineries and synthetic fuel plants at Ploiești Luna and elsewhere come under sustained bombardment. Allied assessments show overall petroleum production in the Reich falling by more than half between the spring and the autumn of 1944, with aviation gasoline output reduced even more steeply. As P-51 groups move forward from English bases to airfields in Normandy and later in Belgium, their combat radius covers the main industrial and transport centres of the Reich, from airfields much closer to the German border. German fighters increasingly sit parked on dispersal strips for lack of fuel, while ground crews cannibalize some airframes to keep others flying. Training units cut back further on flying as reserves of aviation gasoline decline. Radar sites and communications nodes face repeated attack from fighter bombers and medium bombers, reducing the effectiveness of the once integrated system that guided interceptors to the bomber streams. The air defense structure that had inflicted such severe losses on 8th Air Force in 1943 is now under sustained pressure in turn, and can no longer contest control of the daytime sky over Western Europe in the Purst, the way it once did. September 1944, Ruhr Valley. P-51 pilots drop to rooftop height and rake rail lines until locomotives vanish in clouds of steam and smoke. 8th Air Force can now send about 1,000 heavy bombers on a single day's work into Western Germany with dense long-range escort overhead. Flak gunners who once watched small, isolated formations now see continuous daylight streams that stretch from horizon to horizon and know that their own fighters cannot be everywhere at once. German jet units begin to appear over the Reich. Twin-engine Me-262 fighters and R-234 bombers climb faster than any piston aircraft in Allied service, yet they operate from a handful of airfields and depend on carefully prepared concrete runways and scarce, high-octane fuel. Many sorties end not against bomber formations, but in accidents during takeoff and landing, or under attack from Allied fighters that orbit near the jet bases and strike as the new aircraft line up to land. The jets add danger but do not reverse the tide. Through the autumn, Allied tactical and strategic air forces integrate their effort. 8th Air Force bombers pound synthetic oil plants and marshalling yards, while 9th Air Force and RAF fighter bombers grind down road and rail movement inside France and the Low Countries. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's day fighter arm in the West is operating with far fewer experienced pilots than in earlier years. Training programs shorten flying hours before frontline posting are cut, and many young pilots meet American formations with only limited time on their aircraft type. December 1944. Ardennes. German panzer divisions roll west under low cloud and winter fog that initially ground most Allied aircraft. For several days, the battle is decided almost entirely by artillery and armour. When the weather breaks, 8th and 9th Air Forces and RAF units pour thousands of sorties over the battlefield in support of the ground counter-offensive. Fighter bombers smash columns on the narrow roads, heavy bombers hit road and rail centres feeding the salient, and the offensive loses the freedom of movement it enjoyed in the first days of the attack. 7 March 1945. Remagen. Elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division reach the Ludendorff Railway Bridge and find it still standing. Infantry and engineers seize the far bank under fire, and for the first time, a major Allied bridgehead crosses the Rhine on an intact structure. In the days that follow, German command throws every available weapon at the crossing. Conventional bombers and fighter bombers, dive bombers recalled from training roles, jet units diverted from other tasks, artillery, bombardment, special explosive charges. Many attacking aircraft are shot down by dense anti-aircraft fire. Some bombs fall close enough to damage the approaches, yet the bridge remains in use until mid-March, when accumulated structural damage finally causes its collapse. By then, Allied engineers have already erected additional bridges nearby, and the bridgehead is secure. March 1945 marks the peak of the combined Allied bombing campaign. American and British heavy bombers together drop well over 100,000 tons of bombs in a single month against targets in Germany and occupied Europe, a weight exceeding what they had dropped in the entire year. 1942 and much of 1943. 8th Air Force now operates from both long-established English bases and forward airfields in France and Belgium, shortening flight distances to the Ruhr, Central Germany and Berlin. The long round trip that once stretched fighter range to its limit is replaced by missions in which escort groups spend hours over target regions. By the spring of 1945, German aviation fuel production and delivery have fallen to a fraction of their earlier levels. Some synthetic plants lie in ruins, others operate intermittently under repair. Units on paper still control hundreds of fighters, yet many aircraft sit parked for lack of fuel and qualified pilots. Commanders juggle the remaining resources, concentrating fuel and experienced men in a few Gruppen, while other squadrons fly rarely or not at all. Airfields, already cratered by bombing, come under repeated low-level attacks that wreck repair equipment and scatter ground crews. April 1945. Shrinking Reich. 8th Air Force bomber streams cross into central Germany and approach Berlin with little or no fighter opposition at altitude. Gunners, who once fought for survival on every mission, now ride behind their guns for hours without firing a shot. Mustangs and other Allied fighters sweep far ahead and range widely over an airspace that the Luftwaffe can no longer control. Individual German aircraft still rise to defend cities or support retreating ground units, but they do so in isolation and often without coordinated guidance from ground controllers whose radar sites and communications have been destroyed or silenced. By the time German ground forces surrender in May, the integrated air defense system that had inflicted such severe losses on 8th Air Force in 1943 has been dismantled piece by piece. The key elements of that collapse, destruction of fuel production, attrition of trained pilots, loss of radar and communications nodes, and the permanent presence of long-range Allied fighters over the Reich, are the conditions under 2040s, which the mighty 8th can conduct broad daylight bombing operations almost at will. The air war over Nazi Germany ends not with a single decisive raid, but with the steady disappearance of effective opposition in the sky. May 1945. Europe at peace. 8th Air Force has flown more than 600,000 combat sorties and dropped over 670,000 tons of bombs on enemy territory. 47,483 of its men have become casualties, and more than 26,000 lie dead beneath white crosses, from England to the Elbe. Those losses amount to roughly half of all United States Army Air Force's casualties in the entire war. The Luftwaffe's fighter force has been broken. Wartime and post-war tallies show that many thousands of German fighter pilots have been killed or gone missing, and the pre-war cadre of instructors and aces has disappeared from the order of battle. Synthetic oil plants stand as blackened ruins, rail networks lie severed at 1,000 points, and aircraft factories that once turned out thousands of machines each month stand silent or dispersed. The mechanized armies that conquered Europe in 1940 no longer move at will. Fuel rations and shattered transport decide where they can fight and how long they can hold. RAF Bomber Command's night offensive. 15th Air Force strikes from Italian bases, and Soviet advances from the east close the ring that 8th Air Force hammers shut by day. Precision claims will be argued for decades, and photographs show city blocks burned as completely as any night area raid. Yet the surviving records are clear enough. German fuel transport and fighter production fall below the levels needed to sustain organized resistance. The mighty 8th prepares for redeployment to the Pacific as headquarters moves toward the new B-29 Superfortress campaign, but Japan surrenders before its units can be committed. The heritage passes into post-war strategic bomber wings and later into global strike forces that still carry the 8th Air Force numeral. Veterans return to East Anglia fields now overgrown with wheat and stand where hardstands once waited empty after every mission. Above central Germany, in early 1944, the bomber streams flew through storms of steel and fire, while German controllers below threw every available fighter against them. By the spring of 1945, the same skies stretch empty and blue from the North Sea to the Alps. No German fighter climbs to challenge the formations that cross the Rhine at 25,000 feet under long-range Mustang escort. The experiment that began in 1942 with a handful of heavy bomb groups on borrowed English fields has ended 3 years later, with unchallenged Allied aircraft filling the heavens over a defeated Reich. The air war is won. The cost is carved forever in stone and memory.